So you have been hit by the isekai truck and sent into a limbo. Over there, you are told by the divine intelligence that you are getting reincarnated as a samurai. But you have to specify the time period you will be reborn in. Obviously, the role of the samurai and their weaponry changed throughout history. So if you choose the wrong time period, you'll probably miss out on all the fun and don't even get to swing a katana. So, to help you choose the best time period to be a samurai in, let's look at the evolution of the samurai throughout the ages. If you go too far back into Japan's history, before the Heian period, which lasted between 794 to 1185, there weren't even any samurais back then. But virtually all cultures throughout history have their own warriors, and Japan is no exception. Back then, their sword and armors still resembled their counterpart from the Asian mainland. They used straight double-edged swords, tsurugi, and wear the tanko, and later the keiko lamellar armor. If you compare it to the armor from the Chinese Han Dynasty and the Korean Gaya Confederacy, then you can obviously see the similarities. We can see the beginning of the samurai class from the 6th century onwards, when Japan started importing technology, Buddhism, and writing system from Korea and later China. And along with this, Confucianism. The reason why Confucianism spread really easily is not because it is an ideology forced onto other people by China, but because it is baked onto education itself. The Confucian education included systems of government, history, poetry, and many other technical skills, such as the arts of war. So if you want to get educated, it is almost inevitable that you will absorb the Confucian principles your education is based on. So that's why the Confucian class system was eventually adopted by Japan too. At the bottom of the totem pole are the merchants, followed by artisans, farmers, and on top of them, the Si, or the warrior official class. Even though Japan absorbed a lot of Chinese influences, they never took these ideas wholesale. For example, the concept of mandate of heaven was pretty much ignored, because along with the concept comes the idea that the people have the right to overthrow corrupt and ineffective emperors. But since the Japanese emperors claim a divine bloodline and don't want to be overthrown, that part goes into the bin. In Japan, the Si class was replaced by the samurai class, but they still had similar functions. Their main purpose is to serve the ruler, local or imperial. The word samurai comes from saburao, which means to serve. Originally in China, the Si class was made up of both warriors and administrator officials. It had existed since at least the Song Dynasty. But since the Chinese warring states, the class gradually skewed towards administrators, because China began to field mass infantry as their preferred warring method, and logistics became more important than individual bravado. The ratio will change depending on the dynasty, of course, but in general, there were always more administrators than warriors in later Chinese dynasties. During the Asuka and Nara period, Japan tried to emulate this, and their warrior officials are called Bushi. That's why, if you don't specify that you want to be a Bushi, you might end up like Gomekichi here, who counts rice for a living. We get the early samurai right around the Heian period. This is when Japan stopped sending official missions to Tang Dynasty China, because the dynasty was consumed by war and chaos towards its end. And Japan went its own way. This is also where you will get your fancy curved swords. But your main weapons are really the bows and arrows. The samurai equipment is really designed around the fighting method they use against their enemies. During this period, the Heian court was still expanding, and their main enemy were the Emishi, natives of northeastern Japan. The Emishi were related to the earlier migrants to Japan, the Jomon people, and they might also be related to the Ainu. But academics are still debating who they exactly were. Anyway, the point is that they are from a different culture and they had different fighting methods that included horseback archery and guerrilla tactics. The Chinese infantry method didn't work that well against them, so the Yamato people had to adapt. The Bushis took up horse riding and archery, and the classic Oyoroi armor was developed during this time period. Before the 900s, cavalry swords had already taken the single-edged form. Originally, Japan used the chokdo, like the one used by the cavalries of the Han and Tang Dynasty China, because this form is sturdier and better suited for cavalry combat. Eventually, they evolved into the tachi, the curved longsword that's the precursor to the katana. This worked fine for their war against the Emishi, since their armor is not especially tough. Tachis were usually accompanied by the tanto dagger. This period also saw the rise of the shogun as political leader. The original term was Sei Daishogun, which meant the great general who conquers the barbarian. As various local clans become more powerful, more samurais under them became Bushi. Well, they usually receive both warriors training and Confucian education, but fighting had become a more important part of their role. When the shogun reduced the emperor into a political figurehead, after the Genpei War, the Bushis gained prominence. A great revolutionary leap of the Bushis happened after the Mongol invasion of Japan, because the Mongols and the Continental Force brought with them tough and heavy armors. This made the Bushis rethink the designs of their weaponry. Apart from bows and arrows, the spear, yari, also became their main weapon. The big and curved tachi fell out of favor for various reasons. So, the uchi katana, which had more penetrating power and was more suited for close-quarter combat, was developed. And this thing is later known as your good old katana. It is generally shorter than the tachi. Otherwise, it is kinda hard to tell between the two, because the length of these swords weren't standardized. One way to tell them apart is to pull out the hilt and look at the side where the blacksmiths signed their names on the tang. This is just pure ego. Nobody is going to see it with the hilt on, but the signature is supposed to point outwards, away from the wearer, to be, quotation mark, shown to everyone else. The tachi is intended to be worn with the blade facing down, and the katana with the blade facing up. The reason they are worn this way is because the katana is shorter, and you can pull it out and cut downwards in one smooth motion. With the tachi, you will have to pull it out first before you swing it, in two separate motions. The tanto was replaced by a smaller version of the katana, called wakizashi, and this combination became known as the daisho, which means big and small. It will become the symbol of the samurai class later in the Edo period, when only samurais were allowed to carry them. Philosophically, Zen Buddhism also became popular among Bushis because it was promoted by Hojo Tokimune, the shogun regent who was in charge of the defense against the Mongol invasions. The next big evolutionary leap happened during the Sengoku period, when the whole of Japan was fighting a massive civil war for almost 150 years. During this time, European traders came to Japan and their muskets were reverse engineered to produce the Tanegashima, which dramatically changed the nature of the warfare. During this time, infantry became popular again, specifically musket infantry. Guns replaced the bows and arrows as the Bushi's main weapon, and some yorois were created with European influences. These yorois are called Nanban do Kusoku. Yeah, the Europeans used to be called Nanbans, which meant southern barbarians, because from their perspective, the Europeans had to sail up to Japan from the south. Some of the armors which were tested against gunshots are called Tameshi Kusoku, which meant tested armor. Once the Sengoku period was over and the Tokugawa shogunate gained control, the long period of peace completely changed the role of the samurai. In the peaceful Edo period, Bushis are no longer needed. They used to laugh at kanekichi, but now they are the ones who are left without a job because they neglected their education or couldn't afford one. Lots of Bushis became ronin, wandering around the country in search of a job, Some even had to abandon their samurai title to survive by entering into other occupations. Most commoners even started to see them as social parasites. Finally, the age of the samurai came to an end after the Meiji Restoration, when the emperor was restored to power and the privileges of the samurai were systematically diminished in the nation's pursuit to modernize Japan. Eventually, the four classes, including the samurai, was abolished. By now, you might be wondering why I haven't said anything about Bushido, the so-called way of the Bushi. Well, that's because Bushido wasn't really a thing that Bushis followed. It is a post hoc romanticism of what the Bushis actually did, written by people living mostly in the peaceful Edo period. The Hagakure, which is popularly known as the Bible of the Bushido, was just a compilation of a single Bushi's view on Bushido, Yamamoto Tsunetomo. He was born over 40 years after the Sengoku period, and his views were written later in his life, after almost a century of peace. He worked for the Nabeshima domain, and his views of Bushido wasn't even shared by other Bushis, especially those from the Kamigata domain of Kyoto and Osaka, who he considered to be city-dwelling degenerates. The concept of Bushido only became popular when it was used as nationalistic propaganda in the early 20th century. So you don't really have to worry about following the code of Bushido, because Bushido is really just whatever a samurai did. Okay, now that you know the difference between samurais of different time periods, which one do you think you wanna be? It's okay, take your time to pick. By the way, my name is CJ, and we release a video on this channel at least once a week. Subscribe so that you don't miss our videos on the history of Asia and the rest of the world. Until next time, stay cool, my bros!